for those who don't know, a biscuit uses, I'm going to tell a quick story. When Sherry first started helping me, I told her, I said, this is 20 some odd years ago, I said, you know, I need to go, we need to run to town, I need to get some biscuits. She says to me, she says, good, because I'm really hungry. This is what I was going after. I didn't name them a biscuit, but that's what they are. Basically, it's compressed beech wood. Now, one of the things that you need to know is that the joints we just looked at, which are basically butt joints, that's because the wood just one butts to the other. Now, I'm usually more accurate than I am right here, but you get the point. I'm trying to do it and so you can see it. There's all sorts of biscuits in different sizes, depths, and everything else. I mean, the one I just showed you is a number 20. They make a 10, they make zeros. Here's one here that's a, I think this is an FF. He's a little teeny guy. Now what your biscuit joiner is going to do, now again, I don't have dust collection hooked up, but I should have. What it's going to do is it's got a blade that comes out and cuts part of the slot. You can also use a router bit they make to do it. They're a little harder to deal with. Now one of the things, now this one I did 4, because I hope you go back and look a little bit, because I had this cut out here on this edge, and when you get out past your cut edge, it's hard to hold it steady. So watch that. What I was going to tell you is one of the things that the butt joint is used a lot, but in reality it's the weakest of all the joints. When you use a biscuit or a domino, we'll see in a minute, you're creating a form of a mortise and tenon. The mortise and tenon, along with the dovetail joint, in my opinion, are the 2 dominant joints in woodworking. They are the strongest, and they have held up forever. They've been around since, I think, well, the beginning of time. Now, do I use biscuits? Sometimes. It depends upon what I'm doing. They're particularly effective when it comes to kitchen cabinets and setting a shelf into something if you're not using a dado. But they create, again, it's a modern version of a mortise and tenon. In this case, it uses a mortise. It uses 2 mortises and then a separate piece for the tenon. Thus, it's called loose tenon because it's something different. And you add glue and you put this together. Now you can see right here I'm off a little bit. That's what I did. But I want you to see that. So be careful in supporting it. And you glue it up, it's excellent. Now, the new kid on the block is the domino. All right, this is the domino. The domino uses, depending upon size, kind of the same concept as the Biscuit, but it's much heavier. Now they come again in all kind of different sizes and whatever, but it does a little closer. The Biscuit is a wide, thin. This is a thicker, narrower. So, you know, in like kitchen cabinet face frames and furniture, whatever the case, it's a little bit more, it's better because you're able to stay in more tighter confined spaces. The depth on it is more so you're able to reach back into the wood deeper. Now I'm just going to give you a quick, I've already done this, this is just a scrap. Now what this does, again, I need dust collection, but I'm only doing one. It's got different bits, and the bit is spinning, but it also oscillates back and forth. So what it does is it cuts this elongated hole. And when it goes together, it makes for a really nice tight joint. Again, you glue it, you've got it. As you can see, I'm not even holding it, and even with one, I'm staying pretty straight. That depth in there, it keeps it from being able to rock or move. Makes for a very, very strong joint. The Biscuit does too, but I'm gonna caution you on something. Many years ago, when I first got a Biscuit joiner, I built a blanket chest, and I had the Biscuits, about a quarter down from the top. Glued it all up. And anyway, about a year later, I saw this blanket chest, and you could look across it, and you could see every one of them little football marks. You want to set the Biscuit and the domino down as far as you can from what will be your finished surface. The reason for that is you're injecting a lot of glue in here, and as that glue dries, the glue's got moisture, that glue, so it kind of swells the wood a little bit, and it takes a long time for it to cure inside of there. And what it does is it will shrink a little bit, and when it does, you can see that faint. So set those Biscuits down a little bit. The next thing we want to look at is the two chosen. I got to stop here a minute. They also have dowels, which is a little jig. I don't have one, but they're the same thing as the mortise, the same thing as the loose tenon. You clamp it on, you drill it, and then you have dowels to match, and you can see that. That's easy enough. They work very well too. Price-wise, a dowel works as well as a Biscuit. A dowel, maybe not quite as much so as the domino, but it still does a pretty good job because you can use larger diameter and go deeper. So dowels are a good option. And again, everything's hidden. But my favorite, again, is the good old-fashioned mortise and tenon and dovetail joints. You use dados a lot. And particularly just like here in this cabinet, which is a kitchen cabinet, you can see right here there's a little notch. Same thing down here. It allows us, remember we talked about pocket screws, how that dado is going to set a groove, a channel, to receive another piece of wood. And when it does that, it's going to keep things nice and straight. But also it does something else. That little shelf right there, that little bit, the amount of strength it takes, it's called shear strength. For example, if you were dadoing this and you put some shelves in, and then you came back and you could, plug and screw it, or, use a square peg or whatever the case, that shelf, in order for it to, if you just screwed it in, it could bend a nail, bend a screw, or whatever. But when it's set in a dado, that shelf produces a tremendous amount of shear strength. Meaning, for that joint to fail, it's going to have to crush all the wood below it. It's the same thing as if you see somebody building a house, a 2x4 standing on end. To crush that would take a tremendous amount of force. So dados help us with strength and they help us with alignment. The way we cut them, we keep it simple. First thing is the 2 dado blades I like the best. The one I have on the saw right now is a Forest Dado King. Now you're going to see them 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch. We always run an 8-inch. 6-inch is just a little too small. The 10-inch too big. Simple as that. I don't even know if they make them anymore, but they used to have what they called a wobble dado. And this was the thing that the blade kind of ran on a skew. In other words, it ran on an angle. No, you don't want that. But there's a lot of good dado blades out there. Another one we're fond of, because one of the things you're going to deal with, particularly if you're using plywood and whatever, is you've got undersized plywoods. Now the dado uses an inner and outer saw blade and chippers. Chippers are what make up the wide space. In the case of the Dado King, they have shims that we can use to put in between the blades to tweak our fit. The other one is the Freud Dado blade, dollar width. It's kind of made on the principle of that wobble, but it doesn't. It's not like that. What it is, it's got a dial on it that as you turn this, it creates a spacer in here that will move the blade in and out a little bit, the width. It too uses the chippers. We've had very, very good success with both of them. If you're doing a lot of plywood work, the dollar width is pretty nice because, I mean, you can fine tune. You can do the same thing with the Forest. It's just a little bit easier just being able to do it with a dowel than it is having to take off and add shims. The other thing, I don't do real deep dados. I usually go about 1/8 to 3/16 at the most. And the reason for that is you just don't need anymore. And when you start cutting a big groove, then you're taking material out of your side panels. You're weakening them. And again, you just don't need it. Now what I'm going to do, I've got it set up here on my table saw. I've got the dialed in. I'm going to grab a piece of plywood. We're going to take a look at it real quick. Now one of the things, depending upon the width of what you're doing, I've got something here that's wide enough that I can stay in contact with the fence. I've got a good bearing surface. And this is about 16 inches wide. Much narrower than that, I definitely want to use a miter gauge. I want to be able to push it. I want to have something that I can be behind it. Because what can happen, and you have to be very careful with this, is you can shift a little bit. You also want to use a good push block. Oftentimes, actually I usually, actually almost all the time, I will run the dado twice. There's a reason. This dado blade it's taking a lot of material out. And the inertia, the push, in other words, as it's going into that wood, it wants to lift it a little bit. Making a second pass just to make sure you got a good clean flat bottom is important. That's the other thing that we found with the Freud and with the Dado King. Is the other problem with cheaper dado blades is they will shear or chip out along the edge. These give a nice clean cut. and our wood fits in nicely. Looks pretty good. That's a dado. Now, there's another way we do it, and we mentioned this earlier, and that's with a router and a guide. This is simply a guide, and this is a base. We got these at Woodcraft. Now, this is set up right now with a 3/4 inch bit, and it's designed just to simply make a 3/4 inch dado. You can see the bit. It's just a flush trim, but it's 3/4. Now, again, in the undersized plywood, you can buy router bits to fit them. But we have to compensate for the distance. So what we do is we simply make a guide, and we draw a line, put it up against, put this edge right on our line. And depending upon how you make your gauge as to whether this would be the bottom of the dado or the top. In my case, this is the bottom of the dado. Now, many of you may be familiar with what's called a stop dado. Stop dado means we don't want it to show on either end. So what we can do, just as we did when we did the shelf pins, we can simply put a plunge router on the base, plunge it, make our cut, come up. We got a perfect dado every time. Does really nice. There's another thing we can do with a dado blade, and that's tenons. And when we look at the mortise and tenon segment, you're going to see that dado again. Dovetails. You know, we hand cut them for years, and then as we kind of grew and we got help and whatever, it became very evident we couldn't keep up doing that. But one of the things I refused to do was to compromise the look and integrity of the good old hand-cut dovetail. Now, one of the things for the hand-cut dovetail is, as you probably know, is how thin the neck is. It just makes for a really good look. So we set out looking for a dovetail jig, and we went through about everything you can think of. Then we found the killer jig, Keller, and it did exactly what we wanted. It's simply a through dovetail, and it doesn't do half blinds, it just does through dovetails. But if you look at a drawer and the way we do our drawers, and we do them all the same way, we do it a different. We do a through dovetail, and then look very carefully. We laminate the front on it. This gives the look. This gives you the look of the hand cut. But the thing of it is, as I explained in the resaw segment, I can take and resaw some really nice high figured wood and create me matched drawer fronts and everything. If I was doing a half blind, all of this in here would be, well, not lost, but I'm putting all that figure in behind that I don't need. Now, one of the keys, now this drawer happens to be dyed. However, one of the keys things is that in order to keep that separation and keep it looking really crisp and clean, let's say, for example, I was doing walnut. One of the things I would probably do would be like a white maple drawer, and then I'm going to do a walnut. My front piece here is going to be walnut. Then I'm going to be laminating a walnut figured piece over top of that. That's typically how we do it. The other thing that allows us to do, if there's any issues with the drawer or anything like that, we haven't lost a really significant, nice piece of wood. It allows us to align things easier and whatever. It's just a good way of making a drawer. But the dovetail's the key. Now, so I don't get chastised, we went out and we designed based on a Keller and had our own dovetail system made. It's just we wanted a little thinner neck. But those are gone, and the next best one out there that we know of is the Keller. Now, it's a fixed system, but you can treat it just like a hand cut, meaning you can move the jig to cut your dovetails wherever you want. In this case, we're just set up to make a drawer. We want a half pin, top and bottom, center. It's just a little 3 dovetail drawer. Now you've got the guide, you've got a bearing, and you just make your cut. When I tell you that you treat it just like a hand cut, you know, there's the old argument, pins or tails first, but the jigs, I think the tails are the best way to go, which is what we just cut. And then just simply line it up and draw it on just as if you were hand cutting. And it's oftentimes easier to get down in here and do this with a marking knife. But I'm going to use a pencil just so I can kind of show you. I don't even have to be fully, I didn't get my center one all the way, but that's okay because I'm going to align without problem because of the jig. Then we have the pin jig. Now the pin jig, just so you know, has got to correspond to the degree of dovetail bit you're using. So that's why if you get a Keller, their bits, and you can also buy their bits for their jigs through Whiteside. So you have to use those. You're not going to be able to go here and just use any dovetail bit. Then it uses a simple pattern cutting bit. To cut the pins. Now what you need to understand is you're actually watching this in real time. Now, if you're doing a large box or something, and you're doing a chest, one of the issues is oftentimes you want to let your pins come through a little further, a little bit proud, so that you can sand them back flush. This makes sure that everything's nice and smooth. One of the things I want to tell you when you first do that, what you're going to want to do is to use a coarser sandpaper, because you've got an end grain protruding through a flat grain. And that end grain is not going to cut as quick. So if you take a coarser paper, even a file rasp, hand plane, and do your leveling, then come back and do your smoothing, you're going to do a whole lot better. Now here's a tip. Now, Here's the tip. If you, again, let them go through a little, your pins go through a little bit, and your tails a little bit, get them nice and flush. You can take a nice spiral cut, flush trim bit, and simply, because this is going to be setting proud, you have to be careful with this now. This is going to be setting proud. Is take a piece of 1/4 inch plywood and clamp it on here and let the router set on it and go down and make your cut, and it'll trim your pins and your tails. Be careful with that. Use a wide base router and be careful that you don't tip. Okay? Works nice. You know, the dovetail is probably the strongest joint in woodworking. You've got the male and the female aspect of it, and then you've got the wedge part of it. Been around forever. You know, you glue this and this thing, I mean, it just cannot come apart. But just another word of advice, when this would, on a drawer, this would be your face, because that way, when you pull, what it's doing is it's pulling against this taper, and it can't move it. It can't separate, because the wedge in here, when it pulls, it just gets tighter. There's one other place that I really like a dovetail. And where in the dado section we saw using dados with screws and plugs, the dovetail gives us, a sliding dovetail gives us a whole new dimension, and it's, again, in my opinion, just one of the best joints there is. Let's take a look at it. Okay, what I have here is I have a 14-degree 3/4 inch bit. Now, I like the 3/4 because, I mean the 14-degree, because it gives you a nice little V when we do this. Because again, like a dado, we don't need a lot of depth. I usually go 3/16 to 5/16. 5/16 on 7/8 and 3/4 inch material is kind of my go-to. And I'm set pretty close to that right now. And just like the dado, now if you're doing a narrow piece, make sure you use a miter gauge. Now I did that so you can see something. There's two things. One, you want to use a good push stick when you're doing that. And something like this that will go all the way, that will go across and give you good push down is important. The second thing is when you're going across the grain. Dovetail bits don't like going, they're designed predominantly for end grain, so they really don't like flat grain very well. So what can happen is they can chip. You can get some chip out, both on the entrance and on the exit. Here's what you do. When you're going to be doing this, always make your panels wider than what you need so that you can come back, just like we did when we did the drawers, where we ran it, came back and trimmed our style, so you can cut that and remove all of your chip out. Then, now before I get into that, I want to show you something. When you're if you're doing dados and you got to, do them in different areas, the first thing is do whatever your setup is, do all of them. Then go to the next setup. If you're doing a long case, do what you can comfortably against the fence, but you don't want that fence way down here and you're trying to do the dovetail up, the cross cut up here. You can wiggle. So what you do is you do one end, flip it around, and do the other end. When you mark your dovetail, on your panel. If you will take a miter gauge, this is just some MDF. Draw you 2 lines up, just as we've done on the smaller one on the inside. That way you can lay your panel up here with your dados marked on the opposite face, and you can line it up and move your fence. That's going to tell you exactly that you're in the right area, that you're in line. Here's the other thing. Because it is such an aggressive cut, and because it's a dovetail, you can't be raising and lowering the bit. So it's almost, you got to pretty much do it in one shot. But what you can do is set your dado blade up and remove a lot of the meat out of the middle before doing the dovetail. Saves a lot of wear and tear on your bit. Then we got to make our mate. Now this is a little jig. It's nothing more than sets over the fence. You could just as easily sit against the fence. All it is a carriage. Now one thing you want to do is you never want to change the height of the bit. Then what you do is now I've got this on the outside of the board. Now you can make it run on the inside. That's this as well. Just make sure everything is vertical. You notice I've got a block here. Set it in. You're definitely going to want to do, if you noticed, because you're doing both sides, and in this case we've got a piece of 3/4 inch material and we've got a 3/4 inch dovetail bit, so we're not cutting a whole lot on the shoulders, but you can see how that quickly sets in there. Now I'm going to give you a hint. Do not try to make these overly tight, because when you put glue in there, that glue is going to swell both the mortise and the tenon, which is the dovetail, and they can be very tough to get in. Now, what you can do, now this jig, what we do, what I'm showing you, is I usually have 2 of these made out of the same material, and it does not have the stops on it. Because then what I can do is actually clamp this down, put this piece in, it's a little long, and I can run it through and I can cut it the lengthways. That way I can slide it all the way through the case. Works very, very well. It's something you got to play with a little bit, experiment with a little bit. but it certainly makes for a good case construction. Again, I would refer you to our DVD on cases and bases. I hate to do that, but in this series, it's just so much detail to go into, we just can't. But that the cases and bases will definitely show you sliding dovetails and using them to build carcasses and cases and whatever, and it just works oh so well. That's dovetails. That's as far as we take it. I will tell you this, if you're into traditional and you want to do hand cut dovetails, one of the things you're going to want is a really good dovetail saw. And we talked about really sharp chisels. Two of my favorites, which I don't have it here at the moment, three of my favorites, is the Lee Nielsen. I like that one. And Veritas has a very good one. My favorite is one called Adria, A-D-R-I-A. Little guy makes them up in Canada. That is one sweet little saw. I like the stiff back on it. It really cuts and does nice. It's a nice saw. You know, again, and back to that, you got to have sharp chisels. Mortise and tenon. Again, the dovetail is the strongest joint in woodworking. The mortise and tenon is right behind it. Now, the mortise, of course, is the females we've talked about, and then the tenon is the male. It's not an overly difficult procedure. For years, I drilled these on a drill press, just drill them out close as I could, then take a chisel and chisel them out. The drill press allowed me to get the worst of the meat and get the depth I needed. That worked pretty good. But it did take some time and it was a little laborious. Then somewhere along the line, they came out with a mortising attachment you can put on your drill press. I got one. No, it wasn't very impressive. I mean, everything, it was really hard on the drill presses and whatever, and it was just very hard to hold downs and whatever. I don't even think they're out there anymore, but I'm just letting you know in case you find one. You don't want it. So then I got a little bench top mortiser that's similar to this big one here. Now, this is predominantly what I use. You know, you've got a motor, you've got a drill, and you got a square chisel. It basically drills a square hole with the chisel. Now, the biggest issue people have is figuring out how to set these up. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Now I'm going to say this. This is a big Powermatic. You can find, there's all kind of different manufacturers, and you can get big ones, little ones, whatever. If you're looking to get a bench top, at this moment, the one I found I like the best is the Powermatic. Just the hold downs and whatever like that. Some of them get real weak in that. The other thing you're going to do is if you get a bench top, you want some way of securing it tight down to a workbench or something, because it's a lot of force going on here. But to set it up, what you want to do, you're going to have a chisel, a hollow chisel, and then you've got a drill bit that goes up in it. Now the drill bit's what clears the chips. If you get the drill bit tight into it, it can't clear the chips. So here's the key. What I do. Put your chisel in, and I usually take like a penny or quarter, anything. Bring the chisel up tight, snug it. Then bring your drill bit up tight to the chisel, tighten it down. Then loosen it back up, the chisel back up, and slide the chisel all the way up. That usually gives you the correct clearance, so it'll do well. Now in this one, there's all kind of different. In this one, in order to set, I'm gonna bring the chisel down to my base where it's tight. Then I want a 3/4 inch deep mortise. So what I'm gonna do is I just cut me a little piece of wood, 3/4 of an inch, and I set my stop to it. This one's a little thick, but it'll be all right. And I'm good. So this controls my depth. Then I'm of course got my in and out to control. Now this is just a piece of wood I got setting here. Now when you're doing a mortise and tenon, just as on this table, you don't want to go the full length. You want to leave some shoulders on the top, or cheeks, which I don't ever remember which way they go. This is some really hard maple, and I do mean hard. First cut's always a bear. Again, this is just some good old hard maple. Now I always take about a half a bite. I don't try to do the whole thing, particularly in a hardwood. Now I usually try to leave, like I said, a quarter, half, whatever you want. Take a chisel and clean it out. Not a chisel, but it'll do so you can see. Now you always want to make a little test run. If you can look in here, you can see my chisel is just twisted just a little bit. You want to make sure you get that right. One of the ways to do that, bring your chisel down, bring it all the way out. Gently, and just make sure your chisel is flat to the back of your fence. Works pretty good. Now comes the tenon. I do tenons predominantly one way all the time. All right, we're going to show you. Remember the dado blade? Nothing faster. Unless you're absolutely perfectly square, and rarely are you, I mean perfect. When you nip the ends here, a lot of times it will make the shoulder off a little bit. And I'm not talking about much. So what I always do is I always come in just about a 32nd. Then I can take a chisel and just pare it down and clean it up. I'm a little snug. I'll be right back. All right, this is called a rabbet plane, often referred to as a shoulder plane. Just a little narrow plane. What I can do, I can shave that tenon just a little bit. You don't want to have to take, you see guys taking hammers and just beating them to death. You want it to fit snug. I always leave this, I always cut my tenon just a little narrow so I got a little bit of wiggle room. That's a mortise and tenon. That's simple. Now, while this is a little bit of an exaggeration, if you go back and look historically, like in here, what they would do is they would drill it and peg it. And it's a square peg and a round hole. Much like we did when we were doing, that we talked about when we were doing the screws and plugs. And all you do is once you get, they didn't have glue, so they pegged it. You drill it. And if you drill a 1/4-inch hole, cut a 1/4-inch peg, just like we did, again, in the screws and plugs. And just take and whittle the end of it a little bit and drive it in. And with that, obviously the game is you want to leave a square face. But what you're doing, you're pegging that joint. Okay? In other words, when this is inside and this peg's going through it, so for this, kind of like that dovetail, for this thing to ever pull apart, never going to happen. Works wonderful. Now, I realize this is basically kind of woodworking 101, but I'm going to show you, if you guys are into chairs or you're doing a lot of mortise and tenons, I'm going to show you a tool I'm not going to get real heavy into this. This is the JDS multi-router. Now, you know, it looks kind of complicated, but it's really not. Essentially what you have is you have a router that's mounted horizontal. You can move up and down. You've got a table that things clamp on. Now, when you buy them, they come with a hand clamp. I have the optional air clamps. They're very nice. They're fast. Just don't get your finger under one. I'm not going to tell you how I know about that, but I do. But you won't do it once. The table can tilt. It can travel fore and aft, left to right. When you're doing mortises, you can set something in here like our sample. We could just set this up in here just like so. Set our clamps, clamp it down. We would clamp it down. We can set our travel left to right, set our height. We can set our depth. Again, we can do our stops left to right, and we just start whittling, and it'll cut them out just slick as a whistle. We can then come back. It's got tabs for alignment in different areas. We set our depth on our router, come up to the fence, lock this in place so it can't move forward and back. And then what I do is just go across, cut the tenon, flip it, cut the other side. Got it. I can then set it up to where I can loosen this, drop down, cut. I can cut shoulders, cheeks, whichever is which. You can just fly. If you make chairs, particularly, and you're doing, you got to do compound tenons and whatever. It's really nice. It's really nice. It's fast. It's a chair maker's dream. Unless you got a CNC. And the only CNC here is Charles Neal Cutting. This this and my mortise and tenons is how we do it.